this introduction. Thanks so much for having me here. As you just said, so I'm very sorry if many of you kind of got lured into this room on the basis of a flashy title. That is not the same that I'm displaying right now. I do promise, though, that what I'm talking about does matter for social outcomes. I'm going to be talking about social outcomes in the end, but I'm trying to convince you that in order to get there, we need to talk about special districts and local governance, essentially, throughout the US. So this is a one project that I'm pursuing jointly with Rook O'Brien within my broader research on wealth inequality and social outcomes that I'm trying to pursue throughout this year as a visiting fellow here. Okay, let me get started with some rather broad observations on local public goods, local governance in the US. As you are all very well aware of, there are substantive disparities in the quality of public goods across the US. There are substantive disparities across the US in terms of how well different places fare, be it in their economic opportunities they generate, be it in life expectancy of people, or any kind of social outcome we might want to think about. And scholars often, including myself, tie the existence of those disparities to disparities in the quality of the public sector, of the public goods that are provided. So how well local governments, be it towns, cities, counties, etc., are financed is a key determinant in how well they fare as compared to other local areas in the US in their social outcomes. And this is particularly interesting to me as a non-American when we put this into a international perspective. So as you might be aware of, the US is really unique in its fragmentation of local governments as compared to almost any other rich country in the world, which means the US, being the self-proposed country of limited governance, is actually the country with the most governmental units probably in the Western Hemisphere. There are over 90,000 independent government units in the US. And this is the case because they're not just states and counties and cities and towns and municipalities, they're also school districts and so-called special districts. Now, you're probably well aware of the first four categories here. You might also be aware of special districts, but this presentation is going to be exclusively focusing on special districts. And just here again, as a short reminder of my enthusiasm about this topic, something like a special district, so an entity that has its own taxing and spending power, independent of the city government and the county government and the state government, is not something that is in any way normal in an international comparison. It's something really unique, and the US has over 30,000 special districts, and I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about those. This might sound nerdy, and it kind of is, but I promise it's going to be worth it. Okay, let's talk special districts for a bit. One example here, this is the Lakewood Ranch Stewardship District. This is from their website, their commitment that home isn't just a place, it's a promise. Now, what is the Lakewood Ranch Stewardship District? It's an area in California, just right outside Tampa, northwest of Sarasota. And it's not part of any city or town or any other local government unit in that area. So it's a district that's created for the purpose of community development, and that's its only purpose. What I mean by that, or what this means is there is no mayor, there is no city government, right? There's only this district. I'm going to talk about what this means in a second. There's only this district who takes care of it themselves, basically, which essentially in this case means there's homeowners and they pay home ownership association fees, and that's how they take care of their neighborhood. And this includes everything, right? We're talking about perfect landscaping. We're talking about meticulously mowed lawns. Like it's the suburban dream in a way, right? And this shows in what residents, what homeowners in this district think and feel about the place, which is mostly, this is so nice. This is like everything is well in shape. Everything is taken care of. They're like these community goods. There's like a public pool, whatever. Of course, there's also lots of golfing space. So it's really what some people might wish for. Now, it being a special district means that none of the residents there pay into any taxes of the city or the townships that surround it. There's no property taxation. There's no city levies whatsoever. They only, essentially the district issues bonds and homeownership fees pay for that. Which also means, and now this is the crucial part for most of this presentation, which also means there's no cross-subsidization, there's no revenue sharing, there's not a single dollar from this community in a way that goes into the city budget or into the township budget or anywhere else. Which in turn means this is a perfect place with a promise that is not just order and stability, but also a promise of a investment that it's worth it, right? The district and its residents are very proud of that, and it's just one example among many of those districts across the US that they are able to maintain assessment values at a steady pace, so they're not, the fees are not skyrocketing, and they don't have to add additional property taxes or additional burden on their residents because they are only taking care of their narrow community, right? They don't have to cross-subsidize poorer areas in the city that surround them. They don't have to finance any development that goes beyond their small, well, it's not that small, it's 20,000 acres, their boundaries. Yes, please. It's a good question. I don't really know for this particular example, but the school finance system is independent from the special district finance system. Yeah. So I do think they probably go to private schools in this district, but they might also be part of the school district outside of it. This is all separate, yes. So one of the key public goods when we talk about financing in towns and cities would be firemen, police departments, etc. And special districts are able to outsource these things in a way. So you can create special districts that are like the community development district that essentially bundles all of this under their community, but you can also have overlapping special districts in the sense that within the city there is a special district for firefighting, there's a special district for policing, there's a special district for housing development, and there are tons and tons of special districts that have overlapping geographic boundaries. What it means though is that each time the revenue stream, so the taxing and spending power gets outsourced from the central control, if you want to put it that way, of the city government into a complete separate entity that has its own oversight process outside most of the times of the democratic oversight of the city. Okay, I'll be talking more about the Lakewood Ranch Stewardship District and its connection with democracy towards the end of this talk. Okay, now the next two slides are just kind of for me to sum up what I tried to make clear with this example. So when we talk about special districts, we talk about single-purpose local governments separate from cities and counties. They often operate with minimal public oversight. There might be low voter turnout, limited transparency, while they have increasingly fiscal authority. So the more these separate functions are outsourced from general purpose governments into some special districts, the less is actually going to be decided by the township or by the county government or by the mayor, for instance. And this also means that these other local public actors have less control to implement, I don't know, any changes that they promise within their boundaries. Okay, and special districts controlling an increasing share of public goods. I'll talk about the rise of special districts in a second. And at the same time, there's little evidence that they would be like more efficient in terms of their resource allocation or anything like it. Now, for the argument of this paper, why we care about special districts when it comes to wealth inequality here is that we hypothesis, and this is essentially what I tried to explain with this example here, that this is a tool to circumvent redistributive politics. It's a tool to use essentially special districts to secure services for your own, only among your peers in a way, especially you have a highly affluent district such as the Lakewood Ranch Stewardship District, where only home ownership essentially gets you in, without obligations to share any property tax dollars or any other dollars with those areas in your surrounding that might be less fortunate, right? And it thereby isolates the affluent in an enclave in a way that has profound consequences for local public finance, because those dollars are not being collected essentially by general purpose governments because they are outsourced into these special districts. There are many other things that matter in that sense, that these welfare jurisdictions, if they are compounded into special districts, they can come up with their own regulations, right? So they can restrict affordable housing and thereby maintain high property values that will, again, exacerbate exclusionary zoning and fiscal inequality. So this is independent of the entire discussion on zoning in that way, right? So it's on top of that, if you want to put it that way. Okay, now let's briefly have a look at key definitions, and then I'm going to show you some first trends in special district intensity. By special district intensity, we mean at this point just the total number of special purpose districts in a given commuting zone. So this is going to be our outcome. This is very simple. I'm going to tell you, I'm maybe going to tell you later why this is still probably the best measure because of all these overlapping geographies. It's just really difficult to generate measures of special districts, and we call this special district intensity just for simplicity throughout the presentation. And the research idea then is that wealthy residents can advocate and can create special districts that would avoid redistributive politics and popular oversight. This is not yet like what we measure. So we do not measure, let's say, wealthy residents' advocacy, but this is just the overall research idea. Now, let's have a look at the distribution of special districts throughout the US in terms of commuting zone level number of special districts. This might be a little small, but you should have a screen somewhat close to you. So this is the most recent year that we have, which is 2022, from the Census of Local Governments. And you can see, well, there's a ton of variation, first of all. Some states have less special districts, some have way more. Famously, Illinois, you can also see it almost on the map here. Illinois is the state that has the highest number of special districts throughout the US, but there are many others that are, for instance, in the Northeast over here, but also California and the Midwest as well. Now, since this is called the rise of special districts, I'm ultimately empirically not so much interested in the level of special districts that we are seeing, but in how they have developed over the past 50 years. So this here gives you the evolution of the number of special districts, so the evolution of special district intensity for the last 50 years. And you can see throughout almost everywhere we saw an increase in special districts. There's an exception here for Louisiana, which passed a law that essentially consolidated special districts in the 1970s, and therefore saw a decrease in the number of special districts. Other than that, you can probably identify here New Mexico, but also Wisconsin, Virginia, and well, even Michigan is, I think, above average. Florida too, and some others. Now, if we compare just 1970 and 1972 and 2022, this is what it looks like if we anchor the numbers of different local government units in 1972. And we can see that the total number of general purpose governments, so cities and townships, municipalities in the US, remained fairly stable for about 50 years. We actually see the number of school districts has been decreasing, which is something that is also, I think, more or less common knowledge. And the entire explosion of local public government units is driven by the number of special districts. We almost see twice as many special districts today than 50 years ago. So this is certainly, I think, an interesting development given what I've just been saying about their functions, right? So if this would be, let's put it differently, if this would be about population growth only, then we would also expect these other districts to rise. Okay. So all of this is just to arrive at the research question here, which is, does growing local wealth concentration predict rising special district intensity? And the expectation is yes. If there's more wealth concentrated in the hand of a few people, then they would benefit from creating special districts that that subtract or they take out essentially their properties, their assets from contributing to local public finance, from the local government mix, and protect, in that way, protect their assets, protect their investments, protect their values. So it's a great tool in a way from that theoretical perspective. And the question is, do we actually see that? Now, throughout this presentation, so throughout the empirical part of this presentation, which is to follow, I'm going to focus on local wealth, but I'm going to contrast it to local income. Just in a way to have an assessment if this is just any kind of economic inequality that we're talking about, or is it really this idea about the value of assets, the value of homes, and other stuff that matters here. And from our theory, we would say, yeah, of course, it should be wealth concentration only, right? There's no real reason why income concentration should be in any way correlated with the creation of special districts, because local public finance, again, is highly property-based and asset-based, and there's no local income taxation almost anywhere in the US, which again is not something that is necessarily the same in any other country, right? Many other countries do have local income tax bases too, which would make this entire picture and this entire idea totally different than the US. Okay, so I'm going to contrast everything to income inequality because local wealth, but we do think that wealth is the important picture here because local wealth is linked to public sectors through property taxation, and because wealth inequality is just way higher and it's rising way more than income inequality throughout the US. I'm going to show you some brief correlates here. On the left-hand side, you have income inequality on the horizontal axis and wealth inequality on the vertical axis, both measured as the Gini index in 2022. The 45-degree line gives you an equal, like if both are in the same way unequally distributed, and you can see everything is clustered above it, which means throughout all commuting zones in the US, wealth is distributed more unequally than income. This is based on the GeoWealth data. I'm going to talk more about that in the next couple of slides. And then on the right-hand side, we have the same kind of setup, but we look at the change between the 1970 Gini and the 2020 Gini, and again, income versus wealth. We see that about 90% of all commuting zones are above the 45-degree line, which means in about 90% of all commuting zones, the rise in wealth inequality outpaced the rise in income inequality. Okay, so conceptually, wealth inequality makes more sense to be connected with special district creation, and empirically, wealth inequality is also just more salient. Now, okay, I thought this would be like a very small kind of nerdy group here that everyone studies wealth. So I have a couple of slides here on the actual measurement. I'm just going to be very brief, I guess, here. So of course, there are many different ways how we could measure local wealth inequality. Usually we look at the Gini index, for instance. But of course, this is a broad measure that incorporates the entire distribution of wealth. But for our particular interest, this might not be the right choice of measurement, because it's really about those that have a material interest in shielding their wealth from local governments, essentially. And therefore, what we are going to do is we propose that maybe it makes sense to have an absolute threshold, and we take the count of people essentially above that threshold. Let's say $1 million. Everyone who has more than $1 million probably has a high interest in being careful about the involvement of government finance in taxing their properties. So instead of looking at the wealth Gini or looking at top wealth shares, which is usually the top 10%, we're going to take the share of wealth that is held by wealth millionaires in any given commuting zone at any given year. And we can see a brief illustration of that here, where we have wealth concentration measured as the millionaire wealth share on the horizontal axis, and wealth inequality measured as the Gini index on the vertical axis. And we can see, of course, they are closely correlated, but we can also see that above, let's say, 50% millionaire wealth share, there's not much movement anymore in the Gini index, which kind of supports this idea that the Gini is not super sensitive towards the top of the distribution. And if we want to catch those differences over there, then we might need something like, let's say, the millionaire wealth share. Also, by the way, just out of curiosity, I do think it's kind of interesting how high these shares are in this data, right? So there are definitely areas where millionaires own most of the wealth in that local area, which also makes sense if you think about, let's say, housing prices in California, right? Or maybe even here. I don't really know. Okay, now let's move this to the empirical section. So we're going to use 3 different data sources. The first are the local wealth estimates from the GeoWealth project, covariates from the Census Census, special district information from the US Census of Governments. The local wealth estimates from GeoWealth are essentially based on machine learning imputation based on overlapping variables between the survey of consumer finances and the descendant census, and are to date the only data that we have in terms of wealth on a local level. I'm going to talk more about that in the future. The special district information is from the US Census of Governments, which is essentially a complete census of all government units in the US. It's only complete every 5 years, though, in years that end in 2 and in 7, which also means we have a short lag between our outcome and our independent variable. I'm going to show you 3 different steps of analysis, OLS models, 2 fixed effect models, and then I'm trying to convince you of this shift share instrument that I created. Okay, the main outcome variable here is the number of special districts. We log it. It's a 2 years lag because it's measured in, let's say, 1992, 2002, 2012, 2022, etc. So for the period between 1972 and 2022. And then our independent variable is the millionaire wealth share. So the total share of wealth that millionaires own as a fraction of the total wealth in that commuting zone based on net wealth, private net wealth estimates from GeoWealth. There's a bunch of covariates that we stepwisely include, mostly to take into account socio-demographic changes, economic changes, and the other local government units, so the number of school districts and the number of the number of general purpose governments, so the number of cities and towns, etc. And as I said, we contrast everything to the income inequality Gini. Okay, now, if you're not super into methods and you're already a little sleepy after this first half an hour, so no, 20 minutes, this figure is the one that you should look at. And if you buy that, then the next 15 minutes are just more complicated versions of that in a way. So this is the bivariate association between the number of special districts and income inequality on the left side and wealth concentration on the right side. As you can see, there is no association whatsoever for income inequality. There's a clear positive association on wealth concentration here. This is, of course, this is pooling like all years, all observations, and just plotting them against each other in a Venn scatter plot. That's it. There's no other fancy technique behind it. And again, theoretically, this makes sense, right? This is exactly what we would expect based on what I've been trying to convince you of, the wealthy shielding their assets through special district creation. Okay, of course, there's no temporal ordering, there's nothing. This is just, the bivariate pooled association. Okay, now here we have the pooled OLS results. What I'm now going to do for the next slide 2 is, in the first model, I'm going to show you the bivariate between the wealth concentration measure, and the second model, I'm going to show you the bivariate with income inequality measure. And in the third model, I'll have those two things together, but nothing else. And then in the fourth model, we have all the covariates that I mentioned before, plus in the OLS model, year fixed effects. And we can see, the coefficient on wealth concentration is pretty consistent throughout. We can see that income inequality is, not super stable, but it's becoming significant here, and negative in the final model. But again, this is just the pooled OLS model, right? So this is again pooling all the years and throwing them together. I do think though, before I usually don't like to start with, let's say, the IV right away, because I do want to convince you that this is not what I'm going to show you is not a function of some very specific model, but this is just throughout all of these specifications, we kind of end up with the same story. Okay, now let's do the very same thing for the two-way fixed effects models. Here we have again the same setup. The first model is going to be wealth concentration only. Now with year and commuting zone fixed effects in each model. The second one is for income inequality. The third model is income and wealth inequality. And the fourth model is including all the covariates. And it's pretty much the same picture again. Now we have this classical setup where we essentially have a within estimator. So we compare the evolution of special districts within a given commuting zone, net of common shocks among all commuting zones, and net of stable differences between those commuting zones. And we can see, wealth concentration, that coefficient is really stable across all these specifications. Again, income inequality actually starts positive here and turns negative in the last model, so very shaky. Again, pretty much in line with what we would expect from our initial setup. Okay, now, so far so good. By the way, these wealth concentration coefficients here are not a function or not an artifact of the measure of millionaire wealth share, which is kind of a weird measure maybe. They're the same if we look at the wealth Gini or if we look at wealth concentration. But I needed to convince you of the millionaire wealth share for the next step, which is the shift share instrument. Now, overall, as a general idea, shift share approaches use variation from the initial baseline period exposure. In our sense, in our model, this is 1970. and project trends forward based on the national evolution of, in this case, wealth concentration. And thereby, the measure that we create should be exogenous to any local shock or any local development in terms of wealth concentration. I'm going to talk about this for the next couple of slides. So what we essentially do for this is to ensure wealth concentration at the commuting zone level using the millionaire household wealth shares from 1970 and project these forwards based on national trends of millionaire wealth. And thereby, it's essentially this is the same approach as these other papers do. It is interestingly basically the exact same approach that Boston et al. Did in 2013 with an income inequality measure. So as far as I know this is the first time that I see, that I've never seen, let's put it that way, I've never seen a shift share instrument for wealth inequality, but I'm curious to hear if you have, if you have. So what we do is about 5 different steps. I'm going to walk you through them in a more let's say, extensive matter, just to be clear that I'm being clear about what we're actually doing here. So first of all, we need the national growth factors. So for each decade, we calculate the national median of the average millionaire wealth and the total wealth of each decade. Just to be clear, we're using the median here, so that our results are not driven by any outliers that drive the national average, right? So the median should be fairly consistent, even though we would take out, let's say, some explosive growth and wealth concentration in, I don't know, California, right? So the median should isolate or protect us against this problem. In that second step, we then ensure our baseline exposures, which means for each commuting zone in 1970, we compute the 3 different baseline exposures, which is the fraction of households in the commuting zone that are millionaires. It's the average wealth of millionaires in that commuting zone, and it's the total wealth in that commuting zone. All of this is based on the geo wealth data, and they publish these millionaire counts on their GitHub page, and this is what we use. Okay, once we have this baseline exposure, which is 1970 values of those things, we can impute millionaire wealth and millionaire households by essentially simply multiplying the baseline exposure with the national trends over time. So for the number of millionaires, we simply take the baseline 1970 measure in commuting zone 1, basically, and multiply it by the number of households in each period. So we project forward if there's essentially a growth in households and the population growth in the commuting zone. So we adjust for that by taking the fixed number of millionaires and multiplying it with the population growth. And then for the millionaire wealth, the average millionaire wealth, we multiply our baseline exposure, again, so the millionaire wealth in 1970, by the millionaire wealth growth on the national median level, right? And the same, and this then, if we multiply those things together, so the number of millionaires and the average millionaire wealth imputed, we end up with the imputed millionaire wealth, so the total wealth that those millionaires own in each commuting zone, based on the national forward projection of millionaire wealth. And thereby, this measure should be exogenous to any local shocks, right? Because it's simply forwarding, in a way, their millionaire wealth in the initial baseline period by the national trend. Yes? I'm not sure I understand the question. The shift share instrument, though, is precisely for that issue that we take into, or like we, how we create an instrument that is exogenous to movements of millionaires into special districts, right? We could imagine that all the millionaires move to, let's say, southern Florida, and this is where the special districts are, and thereby what we are capturing is actually just sorting into those into those areas, right? Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean the story would be that the wealthy create those special districts because it protects their interests. No, that's not. That's also an interesting approach, yeah. And that would also, let me note that down. But it's not a shock approach in that way. Okay. What we then do is essentially we do the same thing for total wealth. So for each commuting zone, we had the baseline 1970 total wealth, and we project the total wealth forward based on the national median growth in total wealth. And then the instrument that we get is dividing the imputed millionaire wealth by the imputed total wealth. And thereby we end up with a measure, again, that should be exogenous to local shocks in the economy or in the share of millionaires or whatsoever. Okay, and very briefly, this is our result here. What you can see is first, I show you the reduced form IV, which essentially means this is just a two-way fixed effects regression that also has, instead of the original millionaire wealth share, our imputed millionaire wealth share measure, which yields the same result. Then the first stage IV essentially regresses our imputed millionaire wealth share on the observed millionaire wealth share and shows us, yeah, they are closely related, which makes a ton of sense given how we have set this up. And then the third one is finally our main outcome here, where we do see a clear positive coefficient on wealth concentration for the number of special districts in that given commuting zone. We can again see income inequality is interestingly here slightly negative and associated with. Yeah, I'm happy to hear your thoughts on that. But again, so even that stage, very supportive, very much in line with the original intuition that we had. Okay, now, so I've been working on this instrument for the last 5 weeks or so it's pretty new to me. I've done a bunch of robustness checks for now. If you have any suggestions of what you would want to see for to be able to actually believe me, then please let me know that in the Q&A. I'm happy to work on more checks. What I've done so now is some residual checks using the imputed the instrument essentially to impute for the wealth inequality Gini instead of the millionaire wealth concentration, using a different baseline year. So of course, everything in this shift share world depends on the baseline exposure, right? So the baseline 1970 measure is really important because this is where the variation comes from. If we do that with 1980 as the baseline instead of 1970, we still have the same results. The same is true for some Monte Carlo simulations and introducing noise to the measures. Lagging the outcome by 12 instead of 2 years, and doing some placebo tests with other variables that are not sensibly correlated, or which shouldn't be correlated with our measure. All of this supports what I've just been saying. Now, how much? I still have a little time. Okay. A couple of other things I want to mention. So this was the overall big story, right? This is what I'm trying to sell. But now I have some other findings I just wanted to briefly mention in terms of heterogeneity here. One, and I don't want to get too deep into the details of local public finance, but states differ in how much opportunities they give to local actors to actually create those special districts. Right? In some states, no way, you just can't do it. Right? In others, yeah, go ahead, you can create it whatever you want. There's a lot of variation across states, so it does matter in which state you are in order to be able to actually pursue that strategy of shielding your wealth through special district creation. This analysis that we've done so far is based on home rule status, so it just divides all the communities into 3 different samples, depending on how feasible it is for local actors to actually create special districts. And we can see, yes, the action comes from those states where it's easier to create a special district, which again is kind of intuitive. This is exactly what we would expect. There are other results, well, preliminary results that I think are also interesting. So most of the action, again, if we divide our sample, most of the action comes from areas that have either been more diverse in 1970 baseline period, or that saw a greater increase in diversity between 1970 and 22, which again kind of supports this idea of white flight, so that it's rich, affluent, wealthy white populations that try to exclude their wealth from subsidizing essentially a diverse community. And then the last one I think is very intuitive. So of course, much of this is about home ownership. If we split our sample into those with above median home ownership rates in the baseline period and those below, we can see, yes, the action comes from those places that have more homeowners, which again makes sense because it would be wealthy homeowners that have the most invested interest in, again, shielding their property against cross-subsidization. Okay, finally, well, not finally, but almost finally, the motivation or the kind of explanation, the storyline that I gave you was on property taxes, right? Which is one key element, which again varies a lot across the states. It's not always that straightforward, but the idea would be, I'm shielding my property value against the intervention from local public actors. I do not want to fund these other communities, right? I keep it to myself. So from this argumentation, we should see less local property tax revenue in those areas. So what we do is we run our models again. We include an interaction term between special district intensity and the wealth concentration, so the millionaire wealth share, the punitive one as well. And we can see, regardless of if this is the OLS, the 2 fixed effects, or the instrument, there's a negative coefficient on the interaction term, which again supports this idea that there's less revenue generated from local property taxes in those areas where there's more millionaire wealth concentration and there's an increasing rise in special districts, which directly supports, I think, this main idea. Which is also, by the way, we would usually think, when there's more millionaire wealth, there should be more property revenue, right? Okay. Now, let me briefly talk about some limitations. So of course, data quality is an issue. There's no way for me to assess how good the wealth estimates based on the overlapping variables of the census and the consumer finances are. I thought I would make like some little jokes here about Michigan being able to provide me with data very soon. So this is on your end. I cannot do anything about it. Hopefully there's going to be some exciting developments soon. Of course, I think the elephant in the room, to some degree here, is the difference between wealth concentration in an area and wealth segregation, because ultimately these special districts will, this is mostly about wealth segregation in a way, right? At the same time, we have, or at least I have, no idea how wealth concentration and wealth segregation correlate with each other. And I also think we have still data tasks before us that we have to solve before we can do that. Importantly as well, because these special districts are, like, we don't have any shapefiles, right? There are over 30,000 special districts in the country, and it changes every year. So we don't even have the geographic boundaries for them, which means this is, in a way, the computing zone level here is a ham-fisted approach, if you want to put it that way. But it's the only way, as far as I know, that we can assess it right now. Unless, of course, someone at Michigan is developing some exciting data that we can use for that. Okay, and last here, the shift share instrument. So this is a very specific shift share using the millionaire wealth share, because this is the only opportunity that we have to create this, because they publish millionaire counts in their data. We would also might be interested for other research to do like other shift share instruments. Let's say a shift share instrument for a wealth genie, for instance. But for that, we would need wealth bins and their counts over time, which might also be something that the Michigan team could work on. Okay, now that said, I do think that such a top wealth concentration shift share instrument is very suitable for this very particular research interest in this project, because it's really about those that have a lot, that have an interest in protecting their assets. But for other social outcomes, I'm not so sure, right? So what would be the conceptual fit between something like a millionaire wealth share and intergenerational mobility outcomes, social ties, life expectancy, social cohesion? I do think it's not that easy there. I do have research that I'm working on all of these, and I'm can show you some scatter plots at some point. But most of the time, we would think about the overall connection between exposure to wealth, inequality, and some other social outcomes, not necessarily only from the very top, but from the overall unequal distribution of wealth. Some final and I think very timely outcome I do want to show you, though, is that I do think for political outcomes, something like millionaire wealth concentration is actually also very, very interesting. So a little teaser here. This is state level millionaire wealth share concentration and state level democracy. I call this a teaser because in this seminar series next week, you have Jake coming, and he is the guy behind the state level democracy index. So I think it's maybe a good way to end this here. That's in a current working paper. I do see again a very clear association between rising wealth concentration and decreasing scores of state level democracy. Again, we can also use the IV for that one, but it's trickier because it's only the state level. And yeah. Anyway, so to wrap this up, talking about democracy, let's come back to the Lakewood Ranch Stewardship District. This beautiful place where everything is taken care of for you, and you don't have to worry about anything. Funnily enough, is the voting structure in the district. So again, there's no mayor, there's no township organization or whatsoever. It's just a special district board, and the special district board, of course, is elected, right? It is elected though based on the land that you own. So you get 1 vote per acre, which means if you own more, you have more to say in the district. Now, interesting enough, but short step for that. So this is not unique to that district, right? This is also not unique to Florida. This exists like in red and blue states throughout the country, that special districts oftentimes have voting rights assigned based on land ownership. Now, since this is a special district for community development, essentially all land at the beginning is owned by one local developer, which is a company, which also means they start with 100% of the voting shares, right? And as long as they don't give away too much housing, essentially, they will always control the majority of the board. Which means elections have nothing to say in a way. So this particular case of the Lakewood Ranch Stewardship District is owned by a parent company, and the parent company is the ones who sit on the board. You can look this up. And the parent company is owned by a family trust, a billionaire family trust, of course. What would it be else? And you can also look that up because I'm not going to say the name here since this is recorded, but it's a famously politically involved family that essentially owns through the family trust and through the company the voting rights in the special district. Okay, that's it from my end. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thanks so much.